Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So welcome back to our next plenary paper in ESITIS 2024. My name is Nicholas Adams at the University of Birmingham. I'm on the board of ESITIS, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our next plenary speaker, Liz Bucar from Northeastern University. So let me tell you what a great privilege it is to introduce Professor Bucar, and I want to say a little bit about her well-known work. And I think probably any one of us who is involved in publication or teaching is about to become extremely envious. So Liz Bucar is a leading expert in religious ethics, but with a focus on material culture, in particular questions of dress, clothing expression, and pilgrimage. And her research, writing and teaching covers a wide range of topics, including sexual reassignment surgery, politics of religious clothing, but generally focused on how a deeper understanding leads us to transform our understandings of religious difference, not as something threatening, but as something which potentially develops and opens up meanings within our own traditions. She's the author of 4 books, including her most recent, Stealing My Religion, Not Just Any Cultural Appropriation. And the hardback for this book came out a couple of years ago, and the paperback is due out in October of this year. So if you didn't pick up a hardback before, now's your chance to get a paperback version. Since it was published, though, it's won some prizes. It won the winner of the John D. Kowalty Award in 2023, and in the same year, winner of the DeRose Hinkhouse Memorial Award. It's not the first book of hers that has won a prize. It's quite rare to have 2 books with prizes. And her previous book in 2017, Pious Fashion, How Muslim Women Dress, also won an award. At Northeastern, Liz Bucar teaches courses on sexual ethics, Islam, cultural appropriation, and the purpose of these courses, I understand, is to subvert understandings of cultural appropriation and to enable new possibilities. And she teaches a comparative religion program in Spain. Now, I don't know what you would do if you wanted to teach a course in Spain, but Professor Bucar takes them on a very long walk along the Camino del Santiago as part of the course. I told you you'd get envious of her teaching pedagogy. I was not joking. Her public scholarship, and this is a very important part of her vocation in the academy, her public vocation and public teaching has appeared in The Atlantic, the Los Angeles Times. That must be very painful for someone who's in Boston. And also Teen Vogue. So anyone else had a publication in Teen Vogue? I think not. I certainly haven't. Bucar is Director of Sacred Rites, Public Scholarship on Religion, which is a grant-funded project that provides support, resources, and networks for scholars of religion. So as well as her public engagement work, as well as subverting ideas about fashion and dress and cultural appropriation, she's involved in a core way with including and sponsoring the scholarship of younger scholars as well. So here to address us via Zoom, and apparently the team know as soon as I say this, magic will happen. Please would you give a very warm welcome to Professor Liz Bucar. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So thank you for that that was probably the best introduction I've ever had. So I'm going to hire you as my hype squad when I give these papers. Let me just start by thanking the conference organizers just for this invitation to be with you all. And I'm so sorry that my schedule means that I'm here by Zoom. I know a Zoom lecture is impersonal and sort of awkward, and I will try my best to use my hands a lot and be engaging even in this sort of weird format. I'm particularly upset that I'm not with you all because I'm so interested in this society and there's sort of your core mission and values, particularly since you probably heard in the introduction. All of my scholarship is really, and my teaching is really grounded in the belief that Religious diversity is not something just to be tolerated, but it can really be a source of values about human flourishing if we take the time to sort of understand it carefully. And to do so, we kind of have a long way to go, I think, in terms of thinking through the ethical implications of engaging religious traditions and communities that we're not part of. So that's what my last book was about, that I'll be talking a little about to you today, about religious appropriation. And it's what my current work is about, sort of thinking about spiritual wellness practices and how they may or may not borrow from religious traditions, and what that means for like their efficacy and their responsibility. But I see my task today as introducing the idea of religious appropriation, which is not a term that a lot of people use. Cultural appropriation is very popular, at least in the American context, as a way to express moral outrage. But I want to think about the idea of religious appropriation, think about its utility, but also its limitations for thinking about exactly what your society talks about, this intercultural theology, but also interreligious studies. And this topic usually gets a lot of spicy conversation. So I want to get into it so we have plenty of time to have conversation afterwards. And I'm going to start with two photographs. All right, so the image on your right is from the 1985 comedy drama called Desperately Seeking Susan, starring Rosanna Arquette and Madonna. And Arquette played a bored housewife who tries to add some excitement and passion to her life by dressing and acting the part of Madonna's character, who is a cool New York City girl, but also Madonna, so actually really, really cool. And I'm showing this to you because I'm sure not everyone in this room maybe is either as old as me or familiar with Madonna's signature style in the 1980s. Now, that little girl on the left is not me, but except for that exposed midriff, she could be. Because when I was 11 years old in these 80s, Madonna became my style icon. I tied mesh headbands in my permed hair. I layered black rubber bands up to my elbows, and I wore white fingerless lace gloves, all accessorized with a gold necklace and cross earrings. Now, that was the first time I stole my religion, and it would not be the last. And as a religious ethicist, I think that's a problem. Tonight, I want to talk about something I call religious appropriation, a messy form of cultural appropriation that my field of study, religious ethics, can help us describe, explain, and maybe avoid. And I know that even suggesting that there are cases of something called religious appropriation is a little controversial. Moral outrage over cultural appropriation is increasingly common, but cases of religious borrowing usually get a pass. In fact, the same people who are quick to call out cases of cultural borrowing as exploiting marginalized communities rarely acknowledge that religious communities can be exploited in similar ways. And those who do raise concerns over religious appropriation are often called fundamentalist or reactionary. And the truth is, we rarely have conversations about appropriation. The term is an expression of moral outrage. It's an accusation of unwokeness. Once it's deployed, conversation halts and each party digs its heel in. I see this in my classroom all the time. Once the word appropriation is introduced, students either retreat or feel emboldened to express indignation. And since everyone is convinced they have the moral high ground, things get pretty heated. So what if we tried something different? Instead of using appropriation as merely a diagnosis, let's use it as an ethical framework, as a starting point for reflecting on the ethical implications of religious borrowings. When appropriation is merely used to express moral condemnation, it prevents further ethical inquiry. So instead, let's use it merely to signal that we should take seriously the ethical issues at hand, things that make religious appropriation a particularly messy form of cultural appropriation, such as who engages in it, how it causes harm, and what's that nature of that harm. And so finally, maybe if there's even a solution. So let me start by defining what religious appropriation is. So to begin, we need to acknowledge that religious borrowing and combining has always existed. It occurs when religious communities interact, when religious traditions spread into new areas, and even when new technological possibilities encourage religious beliefs to shift. And certainly borrowing and combining is how some religious traditions are formed in the first place. Some religious communities have doctrinal reasons for actively trying to convert people to their beliefs, and this might seem like they encourage appropriation of their practices. But I think there's something very different about seeking potential converts who will accept doctrines, leadership models, systems of values, and institutions versus a self-proclaimed outsider who appropriates a religious practice for their own ends. And the book I just wrote talks both about political ends, educational ends, and sort of health therapeutic ends. So before I really get into who engages in religious appropriation, I want to distinguish between religious borrowing, just a general category, and religious appropriation. So let me give the definition I gave in my book, Stealing My Religion. So religious appropriation is a type of religious borrowing. It occurs when individuals adopt practices without committing to religious doctrines, ethical systems, ethical values, systems of authority, or institutions in ways that exacerbate existing systems of structural injustice. In other words, religious appropriation is a form of religious borrowing that entails insisting that the borrower remains an outsider, even while they engage in religious practices, and occurs in ways that reinforce existing forms of asymmetrical power dynamics, right? So it's a two-part definition. Let's start with the first section that's bolded here. Let's go back to my Madonna phase and how it inspired me to wear cross jewelry. Now, like Madonna, I was baptized Catholic, but by the age of 11, I had refused to attend Sunday school. And yet, even as I was rebelling against my religious upbringing, my personal style became visibly more religious. I did not wear a cross in the 1980s as a Christian. I wore it as a tween following a pop culture trend. I wore it to be cool. In fact, I only wore it because I was confident others would see it as a reference to Madonna, the pop star, not as my membership in a religious community. I wore it to rebel against my religious upbringing. So part of what makes religious appropriation is an outsider position of the borrower. But here's another problem. How do we decide who counts as a religious insider and who counts as a religious outsider? So religious communities have very porous borders, of course, right? And as a result, insider-outsider status is always ambiguous. And this is part of what makes religious appropriation a particularly difficult type of cultural appropriation to assess and identify. The insider-outsider distinction is not necessarily as confusing in non-religious forms of appropriation. So for instance, when white people appropriate practices from Black communities, in these cases, the public debate doesn't focus on who counts as Black, but rather on whether the borrowing is causing any harm or offense. In religious appropriation, the first challenge must be figuring out who owns a religious practice in the first place. So one option would be to have clear and fixed criteria for who properly counts as, say, a Christian or a Hindu and who does not. But that would reinforce stereotypes and generalizations about a religious community and leave out members who don't fit a dominant mold, which is not something that we would particularly want. So we need a way to determine insider status without slipping into religious essentialism, which is itself harmful. So here's a solution I came up with in my book. Instead of worrying about who counts as an insider, I focused on self-reported outsider status of the borrower who appropriates in part because they believe they can do so safely by remaining immune from a religious entanglement. In other words, I focused on people who just claim that they're religious outsiders and there was no sort of debate about being insiders. They didn't want to be insiders. So my wearing of cross jewelry coincides with my rejection of my Christian identity, right? I was claiming outsider status. Being an outsider was part of why I adopted the religious practice. That means when we notice someone is insisting they're not religious and yet engaging in religious practices, we have a case for something that could be religious appropriation. So to summarize, one key to identifying who is engaged in religious appropriation is to find individuals who are working hard to remain religious outsiders by rejecting religious doctrines, norms, and metaphysics. They don't dispute religious boundaries. In fact, the distinction between insider and outsiders is fundamental to their comfort with the ad hoc borrowing. Okay, but not all forms of religious borrowing by outsiders are appropriation. Or put differently, not all forms of religious borrowing can cause harm. So in addition to the position of the borrower vis-a-vis the religious community and tradition in question, we also need to have some grasp of the power dynamics the borrowing occurs within. And this is the second part of the definition I offered. Religious appropriation exacerbates existing injustice. Now, the act of religious borrowing does not cause harm just because it transgresses a religious boundary. It causes harm because of the way it interacts with existing oppression of specific groups in ways that further contribute to their oppression. So put differently, borrowing becomes appropriation when someone in power borrows from someone who's marginalized. And I found American political theorist Iris Young's conception of structural injustice helpful for this understanding of how power dynamics make some instances of borrowing forms of appropriation. Young developed this term to refer to a condition, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, to refer to a condition that puts large categories of persons under a systemic threat of domination and deprivation. In the case of religious appropriation, existing systemic conditions such as Orientalism, capitalism, white supremacy are what make religious appropriation a form of exploitation or moral harm. Put differently, it's the context of power, discrimination, and violence that make a form of religious borrowing a form of religious appropriation. So let's take a concrete example. Let's take this Gucci turban that walked the runway during the 2018 Milan Fashion Week and was sold at the US department store Nordstrom for $750, marketed as, quote, ready to turn heads while keeping you in comfort. To the Sikh community, however, Gucci's headpiece clearly referenced a Sikh turban, neatly tied to produce a slightly angular shape. According to the Sikh coalition, wearing a turban, quote, asserts a public commitment to maintain the values and ethics of the tradition, including service, compassion, and honesty. But as a sign of Sikh identity, turbans have made Sikhs a target of violence, at least in the US context. So this includes hate crimes, but even state-sanctioned forms of discrimination, such as the forcible removal of turbans by the US Border Patrol agents, and also police officers, which prompted an internal investigation in the case of the border agents, but also a class action suit that in my country against the forcible removal of hijabs, but also Sikh turbans in the state of New York. And actually I was expert witness in that case, and we just settled that case for a quite hefty sum, a class action suit against the police officers there. So to me, the Gucci turban is a clear case of religious appropriation because of the power dynamics at play. Gucci, a global fashion dynasty, using a form of religious headwear to make profit, while members of the Sikh community are targets of violence for wearing the same item. But although religious minorities are often the victims of religious appropriation, this doesn't mean some religions are fair game. For example, we can't say my Madonna-inspired cross jewelry wasn't ethically fraught just because it borrowed from a more dominant religion. And in fact, one of the cases in the book, Stealing My Religion, is about the Camino. I look at that course that I teach with my students and think about the forms of structural injustice there, and also the interplay there of particularly violent history of religious pluralism in that country. But also just, it doesn't get off the hook just because you are doing a quote unquote Catholic practice. Doesn't mean that there aren't maybe ethical implications. So let me give you an example, something else that's maybe a little bit easier to look at quickly and briefly, where some religions are assumed to be exempt from cultural appropriation, religious appropriation. So over the last several years, there's been growing attention to the role of cultural appropriation in Halloween costumes in my country. And yet costumes based on religious clothing, such as a sexy nun costume, seem to get a pass. And these are actually real costumes you can buy. I just did a search for sexy nun costumes, and here's what came up. So perhaps you think that a sexy nun costume isn't a case of appropriation because they borrow from the Catholic Church, one of the most powerful institutions in the world. But the real impact of nun costumes isn't on the Catholic hierarchy, it isn't on the Vatican. It's on women religious, actual nuns, who already face mental and physical abuse within the Catholic Church. To assess the ethics of a sexy nun costume, we need to first understand how a habit functions in the religious life of these women. Now, wearing religious clothing can communicate religious identity and community belonging. This is especially true for consecrated individuals like nuns who devote themselves to religious service and wear specific clothing as part of their religious calling. A habit is closely connected to the values of religious orders. Habits, for instance, are purposely modest, keeping parts of women's identity private and preventing her from being sexualized by others. In contrast, a bad habit, sinful sister, or twisted sister costume flip a habit's original purpose on its head in an attempt to make the wearer seem more attractive. Now, to be sure, Halloween is now considered a secular holiday, but it does have connections to All Saints' Day, which originally celebrates saints, right? So there is this sort of religious history. But dressing up as your favorite saint for Halloween is strikingly different from dressing up as a caricature of a nun in a violent, provocative, or mocking way. So I spoke to a bunch of nuns in the US context, and Sister Allison, who is a sister from the Daughters of St. Paul, explained to me that she and her sisters wear these distinctive outfits so that people can recognize them and feel safe in approaching them with their spiritual needs. And that means, she told me, that nun costumes can be confusing and weaken the impact we want our habits to have in the world. Another nun from the Daughters of St. Paul's told me, the more people let this image of religious women, of religious sisters rather, affect the ways they think about real religious sisters, the less we are able to act as sisters to everyone. For these nuns, Halloween sexy nun costumes rather, can limit their ability to carry out their mission in the world. Now, maybe you think nun costumes are justified as a critique of Catholic systems of oppression, such as patriarchy, homophobia, or transphobia, or sexual abuse. But have you ever seen a sexy monk costume? Probably not, or at least not very often. They're not that common on my college campus. And this is significant, and it's significant rather, that sexy nun costumes are more popular than sexy monk ones, because they leverage stereotypes of women's bodies as sexually dangerous and thus contribute to gendered sexism instead of combating it. So certainly religious minorities like the Sikh community and the turban I talked about are more likely to experience harm from religious appropriation. And certainly practices associated with Eastern religions are more likely to be appropriated by Westerners. But the issue of power in cases of religious appropriation is much too complicated to allow us to characterize some religions as immune from exploitation just because they're associated with powerful institutions or leaders. So even Catholicism, arguably the most powerful religion in the world, can have its religious practices appropriated. And I think a sexy nun costume is an example. So far I've tried to discuss really briefly who engages in cultural appropriation, which is basically anyone who insists that they're an outsider to a religion, and why it's harmful because of existing forms of structural injustice. Now I want to spend some time thinking about why I think the stakes of religious appropriation are so high, which is based on what I see the nature of the harm that it can cause to be. Now, economic exploitation is the most common way of describing the harm caused by cultural appropriation, particularly when the products of the labor of one group are monetized by another group in ways that depend on and reinforce asymmetrical power dynamics. The exploitation of religious appropriation can be economic, right? Madonna commodified Catholic aesthetics to promote her brand. But it can also be much more. It can also unsettle how religious practitioners see themselves, the world, and the very meaning of life. This is because religious appropriation is not just any cultural appropriation, because religion is just not any form of cultural practice. It's a cultural practice deeply tied to what theologian Paul Tillich called an ultimate concern. At stake in religion is an entire understanding of reality, the meaning of life, and even our souls. So when religion is appropriated, the results can be particularly unsettling. Now, American philosopher Joel Feinberg has a concept I found super helpful for thinking about the harm evoked in religious appropriation. The term is profound offense. So Feinberg first distinguishes harm from offense and then a minor offense from a profound offense. He defines harm as a setback to one's interests, while an offense does more insofar as it affects one's state of mind, making one feel disgusted, outraged, and appalled. Feinberg further distinguishes between a minor offense and a profound offense. A minor offense is an affront to one's senses or lower sensibilities. It's a nuisance. A profound offense, in contrast, is more egregious. It is, in Feinberg's words, deep, profound, shattering, serious. Actions that are profoundly offensive do more than put one in an unpleasant state of mind. They are affront to one's core values, to one's sense of self. As Feinberg put it, they offend us, not merely our senses and lower sensibilities. And Feinberg names voyeurism and the mistreatment of a corpse as examples of things that are profoundly offensive. And I think this is actually helpful for thinking through the most egregious cases of religious appropriation. Not all, but some of the ones that are maybe the worst. And so I think, because I think when outsiders insist that they have a right to adopt the religious practices of others, they assert entitlement and disrespect communities and traditions of thought and practice. But in addition, from the religious insider's point of view, some forms of appropriation can be experienced as an affront to one's core values, sense of self, and even orientation in the world. They can be traumatizing. They can be, in other words, profoundly offensive. Let's go back to the sexy nun costume for a moment, just because it's such a visual example. Now remember that a nun from the Daughters of St. Paul said, the more people let this image of religious sisters affect the way they think about real religious sisters, the less we are able to act as sisters to everyone. So she experiences these costumes, in other words, as an obstacle to her fulfilling her vocational calling. And this exploitation of nuns is not confined to Halloween in popular culture. In fact, the term nunsploitation was used to describe an entire genre of exploitative film popularized in the 1970s, in which the celibate and cloistered nature of nuns becomes the basis of storylines about sexual deviancy and demonic possession. In these films, nuns are used for the voyeuristic exploration of sexual and religious dysfunction. And I would consider this genre a profound offense to nuns because it affronts their values, but also their sense of self. Okay, so quick recap. So far we've talked about what is religious appropriation, who does it, and why it matters. So it seems only fair, before we have a discussion, for me to spend a little time thinking about how we can do better. You might think I'm going to tell you to avoid adopting religious practices of others, but avoiding religious borrowing is impossible, especially given the way religion is consumed in our contemporary context. It might also be undesirable because it could prevent us from meaningful forms of engagement, which I know this group is very aware of, right? We don't want to avoid all interreligious conversation. So the question becomes, how do we borrow without appropriating? And my answer might surprise you. I don't think the solution is borrowing less religion, but borrowing more. And let me explain. Engaging the religion of others is not the problem. The exploitation of religious appropriation lies in the assumption that we can consume a religious practice without embracing the religion per se, that we can remain an outsider, but also that we are entitled to do so. So one way to prevent religious borrowing from becoming appropriation is to reconnect the practices to religious communities and traditions that claim them, right, that they come from. And part of this is education. Once the borrower understands the religious meaning of the practice and its associated metaphysics and systems of values, it's more difficult to consume the practice as a mere political, pedagogical, or therapeutic commodity. Trying to understand the content and context of religious dynamics, asking more questions about their effects on us and others, familiarizing ourselves with religious communities and traditions that have been erased. These are all necessary steps to foster more ethical forms of engaging the religion of others. And yet religious literacy is not enough. I think equally important is giving up the hierarchical framing of us versus them that animates the appropriation in the first place. This can occur only when we are willing to abandon the idea that we have a right to universalize and domesticate the religious practices of others. For the non-religious affiliated who think that organized religion is problematic, religious practices are techniques for self-improvement and happiness. For folks who have their own sincerely held religious beliefs or values, the religion of others is treated as a repository of cultural artifacts to be tried on for the personal goals, while simultaneously rejecting the religious ideas that give the meaning to these practices in the first place. There's an implied superiority, either by someone who has no religion or as a religious believer who is sure only theirs is correct, which allows us to steal the religion of others. And we must give up these hierarchies to prevent religious appropriation. What I'm suggesting is no less than a radical rethinking of freedom, because privileging individual freedom ignores that freedom justified as self-optimization or self-actualization often comes at the expense of others. The rights of social groups should be part of our assessment of religious borrowing, including religious groups and groups that are marginalized within religious communities, such as female, Black, and Brown believers. And we need to take seriously when religious practitioners themselves claim that they are being harmed by the engagement with their practices. and use this to understand the forms of structural injustice that we are unknowingly benefiting from. To put simply, we have to realize that just because we can borrow a practice and want to doesn't mean we should. And in fact, one lesson I learned from writing Still My Religion was that all these cases of religious appropriation that actually in some way I was engaged in really depended on whiteness. But what if we want to go further? What if rather than merely understanding and tolerating religious difference, we let difference change us and become a source of values? It turns out the devotional aspects of practices deemed too dangerous for a mainstream consumer, those elements left behind when practices are appropriated, can help mitigate some of the risks of appropriation. So the remedy to the harms of religious appropriation could be borrowing more, not less. Now, on the most general level, religious worldviews can help challenge liberalism's overemphasis on personal sovereignty by shifting our attention from individuals to communities. They also de-emphasize the importance of human agency in general, thus providing us with the way to get beyond self-reliance and self-actualization as the primary goals and modes of human activity. In other words, more religious literacy, my first suggestion, could change our stance towards religious communities that we're not part of, my second suggestion, and how we understand freedom, my third suggestion. And this is actually the kernel of the inspiration for the book I'm working on now, which is called The Religion Factor, which is thinking about these spiritual wellness practices that are very mainstream, whether those are sound baths or plant psychedelics or yoga, and think about what would restoring religious understanding those practices mean? How could they make them more purposeful, effective, and responsible? Okay, so we end now with a quick conclusion before we get to our conversation. So for some of you, the sting of religious appropriation might be personal, such as when campaigns adopt your religious clothing for political agendas, or when the wellness industry promotes sanitized versions of your own religion to you as therapy. Others of you might begin to see yourself as the agent of religious appropriation, borrowing the religion of others in the pursuit of what you consider to be non-religious goals. I myself have appropriated religion, my Madonna faith, some of my pedagogical choices, including that communal pilgrimage, some of my personal wellness practices, including yoga, even my politics. These have all involved appropriating the religious practices of others in ways that I'm embarrassed by. In fact, much of stealing my religion is reflecting on all the icky things I've done as research for this book. I intentionally engaged in religious appropriation to get an inside look into these phenomena. My experiences with religious appropriation show how challenging it is to navigate the ethics of religious borrowing, even for an expert in ethics and religion, of which I am. But when I acknowledge these mistakes, take moral responsibility, and reflect on what I could have done better, I hope these become teachable moments. I hope they begin conversations. And that's what I've tried to do tonight. Thank you.
Do we have roving microphones? Yes, we do. We have two roving microphones, Liz. Would you like to have a moment to compose your thoughts? And we'll take some questions about this fascinating talk. Thank you so much. You've given us lots to work with.
Great.
Anyone want to go first? Juliana, please. If you would very briefly say your name so Liz knows how to say hi to you when you've given your question. Thanks.
Hi, Liz, if I may. I'm Julianne. I don't know how to associate myself. I work for Everyday Peace Indicators. I'm not sure that's very relevant right now, but the first thing that popped into my mind, and I could be way off, so forgive my ignorance, but this seems to be something I can completely resonate with myself, a lot like what you told about your own story, and it makes me wonder how prevalent this actually is. Like, it feels like it might be really relevant to this crowd, perhaps, or people who enjoy, maybe is a good way to put it, enjoy religions, enjoy participating in religions, understanding scholars of religion who enjoy that and whose professional and personal lives may cross. Does it go beyond us, I guess? It surprises me a bit to think that it might, and in what ways?
Yeah, that's very helpful. In one iteration of this book, there was a whole chapter about the discipline of religious studies, right? And is that, what does it mean for someone like myself, who at this point in my life is not religious affiliated, but my past work has been very deeply embedded in like Muslim communities, for example. what are the ethics of that sort of engagement? And what does it mean to be someone who, as you say, enjoys religion? And so what are our responsibilities to that sort of enjoyment, right? In terms of creating public literacy. The way I've sort of resolved that for myself, which is part of the inspiration of directing that project, that grant funded project, Sacred Rights, which is, something new I've come to. This is only since like 2016, 2017, is that I am very intentionally trying to be useful with my research in the world, which I'm sure this room is as well, right? That I really spent a lot of time thinking about bigger vocational questions that I didn't early on in my career. It was enough just to be interested in the material. And now I'm much more careful about, what's the end utility to either this community, or if Stealing My Religion is written for like white ladies doing yoga, what is it that I want them to do differently at the end? Like, what's the call to action? Not just making people feel bad about doing yoga, but how is this a moment to learn about Orientalism, whiteness, capitalism, whatever. But I think you're right. I think that there is, and I think that discomfort is super productive. What does it mean to, and this goes back to me for grad school, where I was someone who had a foot in two different worlds. At the University of Chicago, we really separated constructive studies people, ethics and theology, from the history of religion people. And I had a foot in both camps. And that was very tense and uncomfortable. So what does that mean to be, I'm studying this as an historian, but also there are ethical implications to even studying this as a historian. So I think those are all very live questions to our field in general.
Next question, please.
My name is Linus Glenhaber, and I'm a master's student at the University of Bonn. And first of all, just thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. I'm a little younger, and so I didn't really have a Madonna phase, but like a couple years ago, there was definitely a kind of brouhaha of kind of the Lil Nas X "Call Me by Your Name" video that came out, which kind of caused a minor satanic panic, from what I can tell. Like, it very much engaged in like kind of images of like hell and heaven in ways that made kind of many kind of people in America kind of just decide like, oh, this is like preaching Satanism to the kids. And so I was just kind of curious about kind of, with the kind of description of kind of appropriation and kind of this idea of like kind of injustice, and I think your point about the kind of sexy nuns and kind of the way that this might hurt people, like kind of groups that might not be seen, and usually kind of the justification being like, oh, well, but it's the Catholic Church, so it's fine. Like, do you kind of have any comments on kind of like the use of religion in kind of videos like Call Me by Your Name, or kind of like that sort of space?
Yeah, so I'm currently teaching a class on sexual ethics and religion, and all my students do a final project about a piece of lyrical music, and often they're looking at music videos that engage that intersection of religion and sex, sort of to be provocative. So, although the book is called Stealing My Religion, stealing is meant to be provocative more than like, I don't actually think that like the religion is owned, is something that can be like owned. I like Mallory Nye's understanding of religion is not a noun, so something that we have, but a verb, something that we do. And so I guess I think that the use of religion as commentary, which is what actually Madonna was doing. She was trying, she was intentionally trying to be blasphemous for a reason, to make a certain political statement, which is a lot of what the music that my students will be writing their final papers about is trying to do as well. They are reacting to the fact that in the US, for example, evangelical purity culture is not something that young people escape. They either, it is the other side of the coin is the sort of hypersexualization of young people, right? But they see purity culture in TV shows and reality TV, in their sex education, in their public schools and things like that. So I think that sometimes this is a very productive, and I don't want to like shut down all sort of like political use of religious themes to make those sort of political statements. In the book, I have 3 examples in the book, right? One of them is focused on politics, and it's on the sort of performance and the virtue signaling of putting on a hijab for a day as a way to try to combat gendered Islamophobia. And some of the responses from the community, particularly Black Muslim intellectuals in the US, who were like, please don't do that. That doesn't help, right? So really, like, are the political statements that you're trying to do with religion having the effect that you want to have? Or are they tokenizing, or are they centering, overemphasizing a particular article called clothing? Or are they shifting focus away from the community that is actually, you know, at the center of the conversation? So I don't want to shut down all that sort of political commentary that involves religion. I just want people to be a little bit more aware of these practices mean things. And so, like, putting them on, like literally putting on a hijab for the day and taking a selfie and posting on Instagram may not be having the sort of effect that you want. I mean, and that's actually the takeaway from the book, is that there are all these people engaged in what they think are progressive liberal uses of religion, and yet they're having illiberal, unprogressive sort of consequences because of, really misunderstanding the practices.
Wonderful, thank you.
I'm Indrek Peedo from here at the University of Tartu, and I thought I have a question turning back to maybe the title of the presentation and the usefulness. And I started thinking let's take an example. And when I started, and the example could be like, let's say the sauna practices that have a background in the Estonian Finnish culture and then have moved to like all over Western Europe and Northern America. And I think if we take your criteria for appropriation, then it meets the criteria at every step. That what took place in that earlier time and how it was adopted by those who were in power and Estonian and Finnish were not in power, and how it spread, and then it meets it at every step. So now taking that into account, one, what should we then do? Avoid hotel saunas, or how? And secondly, how does this help us? What's the usefulness of the concept compared to just saying that it was popular, they liked it, and they borrowed it, or like those two aspects?
That's a great question. So a couple of things come to mind. One is, let me just say that the story that you just told means that appropriation is a category that helps you tell a story in a different way, right? It highlights these moments of the power dynamics in which the community or the practice shifted, and like, who are the stakeholders? And so in some ways, the term appropriation would have you shed light and focus your attention, your scholarly attention, on those power dynamics. So that could be a benefit of it. I actually, this question of like the utility of appropriation for religious studies really comes from, at least in my cultural context, appropriation is the word that many, many, many young people use to talk about ethical issues. So the word is already there, and really circulating without a lot of precision. And so partly my interest in it from a religious studies point of view as a scholar, like, if that's what people are talking about, I want to try to like problematize the word and say, you have to make decisions to use this word about who an insider is, what makes it, a bad course is a case of appropriation versus a good case. Like, you have to have some precision on the terms used, but also, if people are using this word to talk about ethics and they're ignoring religion, I'm like, wait a minute, I care about religion. So let's leave it to, it's sort of just a little strategic, right? So I think that appropriation might be a useful category to religious studies, only because it's already circulating out in the world and people think it has utility. And so how can we jump into that conversation? I want to jump into the public conversation that's already happening and try to like give it a little bit more precision, and have it have higher stakes too, right? Like, I think what I've really noticed around the cultural appropriation conversations that happen in mainstream is that it's part of like cancel culture, right? People are using it to call out other people versus implicating themselves. And that's really what I'm trying to do, at least in this book, right? Like, what does it mean to take this term and reflect it back on myself, my own practices, or my own community's practices, or my own country's practices too, right? So whether or not it's useful or not, I think is really an open question for me. It may be temporarily useful, but even just when you did that little like history of this, practice in Estonia, I was thinking, well, look, just you having to have that term had you focus on that history in a different way and helped you tell the story about how these practices are not static and reasons why they change. And that's an interesting story to tell that I think a lot of the public doesn't necessarily understand. But anyway, it's a good question. It's an open question whether or not it's useful or not.
Lovely. Thank you. Nick.
Joseph O'Neill from Trinity College Dublin. I was really trying to get my head around your solutions, which sounded really interesting to me. And I was thinking about comedy. And, how can we use, I don't know if you're familiar with the Irish sitcom Father Ted. And now we have Father Ted festivals where everyone dresses up as priests and nuns and, have a lot of fun. But I'm wondering, in your solutions, is there a way to make comedy just a minor offense or maybe just harm?
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely, right? So like, the profound offense thing for me is not in every case of appropriation. So first of all, I think comedy is really interesting, right? Comedy is a way to have a political engagement and shift people's minds in a really interesting way. So like, certainly want to keep space for comedy and satire, right? As really productive. I mean, my students, so I don't know the show Father Ted, but my students love the show Fleabag, which also has these sort of like, it's dark, but it's a dark comedy that really helps them sort of, which is really having some sort of interesting commentary on the church. So sorry, something else. I've just lost my train of thought there for a second. Comedy. Sorry, I just had something else I wanted to say. I'm trying to recuperate the idea that I just had. I think I've lost it. Oh shoot, it'll come back to me in a second. Would you ask your question just one more time, because I had something else that was more concrete that I wanted to just like holding the profound offense. I'm sorry. Profound offense. Yeah. So let me come back to the idea of profound offense just for a second, because for me, the clearest case that I have seen, so in each of the case studies in my book, I think about whether or not there might be a case of profound offense here or not. And in and like, it's maybe an open question, right? So for the Camino, for example, because you've already mentioned that, the profound offense is not walking the Camino. The profound offense for me is somewhere around the issue that like we're walking to St. James, whose nickname in Spanish is Santiago, but whose other nickname in Spanish is Matamoros, is more killer. And we're walking past, statues of St. James as the more killer who returns the myth is he returns during the Crusades on a white horse to crush the heads of Muslims. Like that narrative getting erased, or somehow that history getting erased by the Camino is sort of where the idea of a profound offense starts to trickle up, not necessarily all dimensions of it. The other case of profound offense that I've been more, which is a real life case, is this court case against the NYPD, the New York Police Department in New York City, where we brought a class action suit because the police officers were forcibly removing hijabs and turbans to take mugshots of people, which is against our own policy. But again, that to me seemed like a case of profound offense. It was, against religious freedom, which is in our Constitution. It was very much, it was an issue of dignity. And so like that, so again, is every sort of form of dress code profound offense? No, but when a state sanctioned, who's there to protect you, forcibly, does it. So to me, that was a lot of that court case was about like, is this just a little bit of an infraction or is this really a profound offense? So I think that you're absolutely right. Not all cases are going to be profound offense. And I think I'm not you could disagree with me. You could be like, no, forcibly removing the hijab is not profound offense. Or I don't think Slayer, Matamoros, that Santiago history erasing is profound offense. But that, I think that you're absolutely right. Figuring out where we move from minor offense to profound offense is exactly the place where the stakes get the highest.
Is it on? I'm Charles Ryu from New York. It's a related question. When does religious appropriation that goes into minor offense to profound offense and cross the line into blasphemy as it is experienced by the confessing, practicing people within the religion, especially when, as it was mentioned, like in comedy and satires under the name of, under the guise of freedom of speech, and especially among Western liberal intellectuals and journalists regarding whatever is our enemy state of the West at the time, like usually Muslim, or before it was Orientalism in the Far East and all that. So when this problematic sort of harm-causing appropriation moved into, I don't know, blasphemy and abomination, and the other direction would be, then what level of appreciation is a line of demarcation, appreciation of religion when adopting a practice or technique or certain motives without becoming a confessing practitioner of their religion? What is that line on both directions?
Yeah. So those are kind of two separate questions. I mean, the first thing in terms of blasphemy, so blasphemy is a Christian term. So I would sort of, to answer that, I'd have to me, answering that question almost becomes an exercise of Christian theology. I might push it back to this room. Like, I don't know where the line between, so I don't know if profound offense is maybe a more inclusive way of thinking about blasphemy, or if there's another level past profound offense of blasphemy. That would be an interesting thing for someone who is much more familiar with sort of the history of the term blasphemy to play with. But yeah, I sort of avoid blasphemy for a reason, because I think it's very coded as Christian. Your question about appreciation is really interesting. You also notice I avoided talking about appreciation. Usually people think about appropriation and they couple it with appreciation. No. The Met Gala, when everyone dressed up as Catholic, when Rihanna went as the Pope to the Met Gala a couple years ago, that wasn't any form of appropriation. That was appreciation for like the cool costumes and the cool outfits that the popes wear. Or no, you misunderstood. I was meaning to appreciate your culture by doing these things. I think that sets up the wrong dynamic between appropriation versus appreciation. So I kind of ignored it I tried to not make that the central thing. I think the borrowing versus appropriation is better because it focuses our attention on the harm really caused. That said, my next book is really thinking about, I'm not using the word appropriation at all, but it actually is addressing that. So this next book I'm writing, if this cultural appropriation is a critical critique, and stealing my religion, right? This book is a cultural critique, and it's sort of like yucking your yum, trying to make you uncomfortable, because I think uncomfortable is productive. My next book is like, okay, fine. So what would it mean to do this better? So if you're interested in, and I'm doing all these very popular wellness practices. So if you're interested in plant psychedelics, what would it mean to really appreciate and take more seriously the religious traditions that have used these plants, for, thousands of years? What would that mean for your own practice? Would it mean that for some things you just wouldn't feel comfortable doing because you would see it as really understanding the practice itself makes you understand that it's something that is not for you, maybe? Or would it make you engage in that practice a different way? Again, without moving towards conversion, because I'm really interested in my current book of thinking about what is becoming the majority of people, at least in my country, people who are non-religious affiliated, have no interest in religious affiliation, are very suspicious of religious institutions, right? And so but are engaging in religion. They are, whether that is like playing with the ideas of satyrs or going to sound baths or, mindfulness, forms of meditation that they're calling mindfulness, or even something like addiction programs, right? Like an Alcoholics Anonymous. What would it mean to take the religion more seriously without moving into conversion? Is there a space of what you're calling appreciation? And I think that there is. That's what I'm really trying to do in this next book. I think there's a way to restore the religious meanings, again, a lot of it involves education, that make the practices more meaningful, more responsible to communities that they come out of, but also to just everybody, and work better, right? Like, if we take the example of Alcoholics Anonymous, which comes out of, a Christian background, those 12 steps or the 12 steps of sin, understanding what higher power can look like will make AA work better for you. And pretending like you don't have to understand AA, you don't understand that religion, can mean that the program fails for you too, right? So I think that space of appreciation is the word you use. I want to do something a little different probably, but I think that's hard. I think that there is space for it. But I think it may be not a one size fits all. I think it very much depends on your core values, who you feel responsible to. And I think it involves a much higher level of religious literacy than we have.
Is it on? Yep. Thank you. It was very interesting. My name is Katrin Alekand. I am from Tartu University, and body techniques and body modification techniques are my interest of studies. And I don't have a question, just a remark. You asked, where are the sexy monks? There are. If you go to Vatican, I visited Rome last August, there is Hot Priests of Vatican,
yes.
a calendar.
Yeah, calendar.
And I found out for my big surprising that it has been the thing for 2 decades already.
Yes.
So I Googled. Almost none of the models is not priest or monk, sometimes not even Catholic. And the second example, I love BBC detective series, so the series called Grantchester, and the clergyman Sydney Sanders, I think, or Chambers, but played by James Norton, first and second seasons. I think there was hardly any episode without Sydney doing gardening or chopping wood topless. Still being clergyman, because when he went to business, he put the collar and he was proper. So I think, I just thought that maybe it's not that much about appropriation, but it is objectifying, and sexy is the thing that sells. And it applies also to monks and clergymen. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yes, I remember the sexy clergy calendars, and my grandmother saying, don't bring me back one of those. I want back when I visited when John Paul was still alive and Pope, please bring me back something from the Pope, but not one of the calendars. Yeah, I think you're right. And I think that you're right. Yeah. So sex sells. I'm really interested in that the role of religion and sex as well. And in sort of, hypersexualizing certain bodies, but I do think there is maybe a difference between celebrating and mocking too, right? And so where does that line? So there's satire, there's comedy, and then we move into something maybe different, like mockery and blasphemy. And again, knowing whether or not it's profoundly offensive or not is not necessarily something that we can understand from the outside. I feel like some of that depends on really asking the communities who are affected. So I work like an anthropologist sometimes, doing a lot of interviews and things. And so, is that part of the PR that priests enjoy, that sexy calendar, or is it hurt their job? Like, did they find it vocationally, disruptive? That would be a really interesting set of interviews to do.
I am Anne Kull, University of Tartu, the person who contacted you at first place. And so I am so delighted to hear your lecture and to see you, and I would be even more happy if you were here.
I know, me too.
So it was exactly what I was hoping for, and I liked it very much. But I also wanted to tell of a story what happened in a conference of the same society in Sarajevo, Bosnia. And a Muslim woman was taking us to a walking tour to different religious institutions in this city. And eventually she got to a mosque, and she was imploring us, please come pray with us. Try how it is to pray with all your body. And I found it so moving that she's offering something what is dear to her. She's offering it to me, who am total stranger, different religion, different culture. And so, of course, we went, we prayed, and it is something to remember for a long time, this hospitality of religion. Come, share my, try my religion, something like this. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting too for the question about appropriation. When the invitation is to come and try out a practice, like how does that change our calculus of the ethical, implications of it? Very different, I think, right?
Can I ask you a question a little bit about what kind of ethicist you are?
Okay.
Because it strikes me that one of the, I'm just curious, I'm asking as a question, whether you find that because of the kind of work you do, there are sometimes expectations that you will tell people what they can and cannot do. Whereas it's quite clear in your amazingly energetic and quite joyful presentation that there's very little about what people cannot do, and much more trying to encourage people to think more, to widen their moral imagination to a degree. The sexy nuns don't speak, they're just to be looked at, whereas the nuns you engaged with have voices, they have things to say, and in fact, it was very striking that even when you voiced what they had to say, it wasn't about what people can and cannot do. They were wanting to tell you what they do and want to do, and obstacles of that kind. It's also striking in your presentation that when people try and tell you about their intentions, your response is to say, you need to think more than just about intentions.
Yeah.
You need to be more curious. And it's not that you've suddenly become a magical consequentialist where only the outcomes count. It's that actually it's an imaginative business to find out what kinds of outcomes there could be going on. That it's not just you that's the ethnographer in some ways. You're trying to broaden the scope of what people are willing to be curious about. I just wondered whether you had some thoughts about the kind of ethicist you want not only yourself to be, but the kind of ethicist you want your students and those who read you to be.
Yeah, I am going to bring you everywhere I go now. Between my introduction and that's a really great description of the kind of ethicist I want to be, what you just said. I mean, in some ways you said, what kind of ethicist are you? And I sort of said, oh God, probably not a very good one in terms of the classical way I was taught, right? So I think you're very right that people are interested in ethics because they think I can deliver a list of do's and don'ts and some sort of, guardrails for them to put on their life. And I'm much more about having my students, so I tell my students, right, I'm very progressive. You're going to come to this class on sexual ethics and religion. You're going to hear some of my own sort of probably progressive ideas. You don't do well in this class by agreeing with me. You do well in this class by learning to think better. I don't care what your positions are on these things. I just care that you understand them better so that your own core values are aligning with them. But then you're right. It becomes less a list of principles or do's and don'ts and much more like, what does moral discernment look like in this particular case? What does it mean to have, I like this idea of moral, ethical imagination. Intentions are, again, the way people get themselves off the hook. I want to put us back on the hook, right? I find myself, and maybe this is me putting myself in my work too much, I learn a lot by messing up and being uncomfortable and acknowledging that. And I think so that's how I teach, and I try to create those situations for writing too. I think ethics is the process. So it's kind of like Mallory Knights' understanding of religion. It's a verb that we do, and it's constantly ongoing. It's never undone. And the beauty of religious diversity for me is it's a place to help us think harder because we're often confronted with someone who's very different from us, a community with very different values than us. So like in my sexual ethics class I'm teaching right now, we do a unit on plural marriage. My students are like, whoa, plural marriage, too much. But, what do you learn by thinking about plural marriage? Or what do you learn about thinking about genital circumcision in a different way? Like, how do you confront things that are not part of your community to help you think differently about your own sort of values? So Yeah, I guess I'm a messy ethicist. Like I just really and I don't know what that means for the field. The way I get away with it in the field of religious ethics is that I'm a comparativist, which is a little bit weird, and that I was trained both in Christianity and Islam, and I now dabble in a lot of other traditions. And so I can kind of get away with being like, well, I'm not speaking on behalf of these traditions. I'm not a moral theologian. I have a lot of things on the table at one time. But the truth of it is, I think that's really productive, and that's how life is. So yeah, I guess I'm a messy ethicist. But yeah, thank you for your question, because it's important for me to reflect on that, because people assume something when they hear ethicists. And then I fear I'm not delivering what they quite want, right? They want something prescriptive and an easy takeaway. But I don't have all the answers, so. Nor do I think the answers are the same for everybody, right?
I think I speak on behalf of everyone when I say, Professor Bucar, that you have certainly delivered. You've given us so much to think about. It's a slight sadness that you won't actually hear all of the conversations that now are reflecting on your presentation, but there will be a lot of them. So I hope you'll imagine us learning and thinking about the things that you've given us to think with, the resources, the very visual presentation that you've given with us, so much to think and imagine with you. Thank you so much for joining us at ESITIS 2024. We look forward to your future publications and wish you all the best in your future work. Thank you so much. Please join with me in thanking Professor Bucar.
Thank you all. Thank you. Great, thanks.
Take care and goodbye.
Okay, thank you.